January 17, 1956. A small government office in Bonn, West Germany. Through frosted windows, pale winter light filtered across a polished oak desk where a stack of yellowed papers sat untouched for over a decade. The radiator hissed softly, filling the room with dry heat that made the air shimmer slightly above the metal grates. In a leather chair, worn smooth by years of use, sat a man whose hands trembled not from age, but from the weight of what he was about to reveal. Reinhard Gehlen, former Major General of the Wehrmacht, and once the architect of Nazi Germany's Eastern intelligence apparatus, lifted a fountain pen and began to write names that had never appeared in any official record, names that would rewrite the hidden history of the Third Reich's espionage machinery. The war had been over for more than 10 years, but its shadows stretched long across the frozen European landscape. In the rubble-strewn cities and in the minds of men who had orchestrated unspeakable operations, the conflict continued in memory and in silence. The Nuremberg trials had exposed the visible faces of Nazi criminality, the commanders and bureaucrats whose signatures appeared on orders and decrees. But beneath that documented layer of guilt existed another realm entirely, a subterranean world of agents and handlers, of networks so deeply buried that even the collapse of the Third Reich had not brought them to light. Gehlen knew this world intimately. He had built much of it himself. Before the ink dried on the Treaty of Versailles, Germany's intelligence community began reconstructing itself in the shadows of defeat. The Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence service, emerged as a sophisticated apparatus under Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, but it was the lesser-known networks, the improvised cells, and the off-book operatives that proved most effective. These were the agents who never appeared on registry lists, whose salaries were paid through shell companies and whose identities were protected by layers of deception so complete that even other intelligence officers knew them only by codenames or not at all. Gehlen's Foreign Armies East, the intelligence unit focused on the Soviet Union, had perfected this art of invisibility. By 1943, he commanded a web of informants stretching from the Baltic states to the Caucasus Mountains, a network so vast and so carefully compartmentalized that its full scope remained unknown, even to Heinrich Himmler's omnipresent SS. When Gehlen had imagined his role in the war, back in those heady days of 1941, when German armies swept across the Russian steppes like a mechanized tide, he had envisioned himself as the supreme spy master of a victorious empire. He would be the man who saw everything, whose intelligence networks would stretch from Vladivostok to the English Channel, from the Arctic Circle to the deserts of North Africa. His agents would be celebrated as heroes of the Reich, their exploits recorded in the annals of German glory. The Führer himself would acknowledge their contribution to the thousand-year empire. Reality, however, carved a different story entirely. By 1945, as Soviet artillery pounded Berlin into dust and American forces swept across the Rhine, Gehlen found himself not celebrating triumph, but desperately burying his secrets in steel drums hidden in the Bavarian Alps, desperate to preserve the only currency that might buy his survival in the coming reckoning. The Americans found him, of course. They found everyone, eventually. But Gehlen possessed something the emerging Cold War made valuable beyond measure: comprehensive intelligence on Soviet military capabilities, order of battle, industrial capacity, and most crucially, the names and locations of agents still in place behind what Winston Churchill would soon call the Iron Curtain. In exchange for immunity and American protection, Gehlen offered his entire network to the United States Army. What began as Operation Rusty became the Gehlen Organization, a CIA-funded intelligence service that would eventually transform into West Germany's own Federal Intelligence Service, the BND. The Americans accepted his offering eagerly, too focused on the Soviet threat to ask uncomfortable questions about what else Gehlen might know, what other names he carried in his memory, what other networks he had constructed that served purposes beyond simple military intelligence. For 10 years, Gehlen had kept those secrets locked away. The Americans trusted him because they needed him. The West German government employed him because he was useful. But in that winter office in 1956, something shifted. Perhaps it was guilt finally surfacing through layers of rationalization. Perhaps it was calculation, a realization that the changing political landscape made revelation safer than continued silence. Or perhaps it was simply the recognition that some secrets left untold become heavier than any confession could ever be. Whatever the reason, Gehlen began to write, and what emerged from his pen was a roster of ghosts, agents who had operated in the shadows of the shadows, serving purposes that even now seemed almost impossible to believe. There was Elena Mikhailovna, a Moscow theater actress, whose real name was actually Greta Holm, a German operative who had lived deep undercover in the Soviet Union since 1938. Her performances at the Bolshoi had earned Stalin's personal approval, giving her access to party officials and military commanders who never suspected that the enchanting soprano reported every overheard conversation through a dead drop in a cemetery near the Novodevichy convent. Gehlen had recruited her personally during a cultural exchange in Berlin, exploiting her resentment over the murder of her aristocratic family during the Bolshevik Revolution. She had never appeared on any Abwehr list, never drawn a salary through official channels, never had a file in any registry that Allied investigators might uncover. Her intelligence had guided Wehrmacht planning throughout Operation Barbarossa, yet her existence remained unknown to everyone except Gehlen and his most trusted deputy. In his confession, Gehlen noted that she had likely survived the war and might still be performing in Moscow, still invisible, still undetected, her service to the Reich forever unacknowledged. Then there was Network Cardinal, a cell of 7 operatives embedded within the Vatican itself. These were not simply observers monitoring papal communications. They were priests, actual ordained clergy who had taken their vows seriously, even as they served the intelligence apparatus of Nazi Germany. Gehlen revealed that recruitment had begun in the mid-1930s, targeting German and Austrian seminarians with the right combination of ideological sympathy and institutional access. By 1942, Cardinal provided regular reports on Vatican diplomatic efforts, on secret negotiations between papal envoys and various governments, on the Church's knowledge of the Holocaust, and on partisan networks in Catholic regions of occupied Europe. The information flowed through a courier system so elaborate that each priest knew only one link in the chain, never the full network, never even confirmation that others like themselves existed. The Americans, Gehlen wrote, would be shocked to learn how much the Third Reich had known about Allied plans communicated through Vatican intermediaries, how many resistance operations had been compromised through confessionals and sacristy conversations. But the revelation that would prove most disturbing concerned neither Soviet territory nor ecclesiastical institutions. It concerned the American heartland itself. Gehlen's confession included details of Network Prairie, a collection of agents operating not in the military-industrial complex, where FBI counterintelligence focused their efforts, but in the agricultural communities of the Midwest. These were German-American farmers and businessmen, descendants of 19th-century immigrants who retained cultural connections to the fatherland. Their intelligence value came not from military secrets but from economic data, crop yields, railroad capacity, industrial production, labor availability, morale in communities far from the coasts. It was soft intelligence, the kind that painted a picture of American economic capacity and social cohesion. The network had been established in the 1930s through German-American Bund activities, but had gone dormant and invisible once war began. Its members never activated for sabotage or obvious espionage. Instead, they simply observed and remembered, filing away information that would be collected after the war when Germany emerged victorious. That victory never came, but Gehlen noted that to his knowledge, none of these agents had ever been identified or arrested. They remained in place, their loyalty to a dead regime known only to themselves, and now, through his confession, to the stunned intelligence officers who read his words. Throughout the document that grew longer as winter daylight faded outside his window, Gehlen returned repeatedly to one particular object, the Dienstbrief, the service letter. This was not an actual piece of correspondence, but rather a symbolic concept in German intelligence culture, the idea of an unsigned contract between handler and agent, an understanding that certain services rendered for the Reich would forever remain unacknowledged, that the highest form of loyalty was anonymous sacrifice. In exchange for this invisibility, these unlisted agents received a different kind of payment, the knowledge that they served something larger than themselves, that their hidden contributions shaped history, even if their names would never appear in any history book. Gehlen had given each unlisted agent a small silver pin, unadorned except for a tiny engraved eagle, no swastika, nothing obviously Nazi, just the bird that represented German sovereignty. It was a mark of membership in this invisible company, a talisman that said, "Your service is known, even if it can never be spoken." As Gehlen wrote his confession, he wondered how many of these pins still existed, tucked away in jewelry boxes or hidden in attics, secret reminders of secret wars. The records Gehlen produced contained no inflammatory rhetoric, no ideological justifications. They read like technical documents because that is what they were. Operational histories of intelligence assets, dry recitations of recruitment methods, communication protocols, intelligence products delivered, and operational outcomes. Yet beneath the bureaucratic language lived human stories of impossible complexity. There was the Jewish mathematician in London who fed information to Germany because the Nazis held his family hostage in Theresienstadt. There was the Polish aristocrat who spied on his own resistance movement, believing that only German order could save Europe from Soviet barbarism. There was the American isolationist journalist who provided analysis of Washington politics, convinced he was serving peace by helping Germany understand American intentions. Each of these individuals had reasons, rationalizations, justifications that made sense within the moral universe they inhabited. Gehlen, acting as their handler and historian, recorded these motivations without judgment, presenting them as facts to be noted rather than sins to be weighed. What the Americans experienced when they finally read Gehlen's complete confession was not simple shock at the extent of Nazi espionage. They had expected competence and reach from German intelligence. What stunned them was the existential question Gehlen's revelations posed. How many other networks remained undiscovered? If the Nazi apparatus had successfully concealed agents so deeply that not even the comprehensive Allied investigation had found them, what did that say about the supposedly transparent democratic society America had built? The FBI launched quiet investigations into the Prairie Network leads Gehlen provided, but the trail had gone cold years earlier. The individuals named had moved, died, or simply denied everything with the confidence of people who knew no documentary evidence could contradict them. The Vatican networks proved equally untraceable. The priests named by Gehlen had dispersed across the global Catholic diaspora, and the Church declined to cooperate with what they termed a witch hunt, based on accusations from a discredited Nazi general. The transformation Gehlen underwent during this process of revelation remained ambiguous. He claimed that confession served justice, that exposing these hidden networks would help the West understand how deeply espionage could penetrate even the most open society. But critics, both in Germany and abroad, suggested more cynical motivations. By revealing agents and networks that were no longer operational or useful, Gehlen was demonstrating the extent of his former power and current knowledge, reminding his American employers and German colleagues that he remained the indispensable man, the only one who truly understood the depth of the intelligence underworld. The confession in this reading was not an act of conscience, but a calculated move to secure his position by proving that he still held secrets worth protecting. The truth, as always in the intelligence world, remained opaque, knowable only to Gehlen himself, and perhaps not even to him. The symbolic weight of those unlisted names extended far beyond simple historical record. They represented a particular vision of loyalty and state power that had emerged from Prussian military tradition and metastasized under Nazi ideology. The idea that the highest service required the complete dissolution of individual identity into the needs of the state. These agents had not sought glory or recognition. They had accepted anonymity as the price of participation in something they believed transcended ordinary human concerns. They were the shadows behind the shadows, the invisible hands that shaped events while claiming no credit, seeking no reward except the private knowledge of their own significance. This was the ultimate expression of authoritarian seduction, the promise that one could be important without being visible, that one could shape history without being acknowledged by it, that the lonely burden of hidden service was itself a form of aristocratic distinction. Against this stood the American system Gehlen had now entered, a democracy that theoretically made even intelligence work ultimately accountable to elected civilian authority, where secrets were supposed to be temporary necessities rather than permanent conditions. The friction between these worldviews defined the early Cold War. Gehlen and men like him brought expertise and networks that the Americans desperately needed, but they also imported a philosophy of power fundamentally at odds with democratic transparency. The result was an intelligence apparatus that existed in permanent tension with the society it claimed to protect, neither fully accountable nor fully independent, neither completely trusted nor wholly dispensable. Gehlen's confession of the unlisted agents illuminated this tension by revealing just how thoroughly an intelligence service could operate beyond even internal oversight, how completely networks could vanish into the bureaucratic shadows. In the years that followed, fragments of information occasionally surfaced, supporting pieces of Gehlen's claims. A former Bolshoi performer named Greta Holtzmann died in Munich in 1967, her obituary noting cryptically that she had served Germany in difficult times. An investigation in 1963 uncovered a group of elderly German-American farmers in Wisconsin who had maintained regular correspondence with an address in Argentina that traced back to former Abwehr officers. A deathbed confession from a retired Vatican archivist in 1971 alluded to German friends within the church who had provided intelligence during the war. None of these fragments proved Gehlen's account definitively, but they suggested that beneath the documented history of World War II, intelligence operations lay another history, one recorded only in the memories of the participants and the fragmentary confessions of handlers who had outlived the causes they once served. The epilogue to Gehlen's confession came not in any official document, but in the quiet unraveling of certainty it produced. Intelligence services on both sides of the Cold War divide realized that the invisible networks they depended upon were fundamentally unknowable in their full extent. Each handler protected sources through isolation and compartmentalization, meaning that the death or defection of a single individual could sever entire networks from institutional memory. The unlisted agents Gehlen revealed were not exceptions but examples of a larger truth, that secrecy, once deep enough, becomes permanent simply because no one survives who remembers what was hidden. The Third Reich had collapsed, its leadership executed or imprisoned, its archives captured and studied, its crimes documented in excruciating detail. Yet still it kept secrets, still it maintained little pockets of unknown history, simply because some truths had been buried so carefully that even total military defeat could not expose them. What those unlisted agents represented finally was the ultimate expression of ideological devotion transformed into invisible service. They had believed in something powerfully enough to vanish into it, to let their names and stories dissolve into the larger narrative of German greatness or European order or whatever rationale justified their hidden work. That kind of belief requires a closed system, a totalizing ideology that makes the surrender of individual recognition seem not just acceptable, but noble. It is the opposite of democratic society, which depends on visibility, accountability, and the conviction that power must always be subject to scrutiny. The fact that such agents could exist within democratic societies, invisible and undetected, revealed the fragility of openness, the constant possibility that shadows could deepen even in broad daylight. Reinhard Gehlen died in 1979, having transformed from Nazi general to American asset to West German intelligence chief. His career a perfect embodiment of the moral compromises and pragmatic calculations that characterized the post-war order. His confession of the unlisted agents remained classified until the 1990s, released finally as part of a broader declassification of Cold War intelligence documents. By then, most of the agents he had named were dead, their stories lost except for what he had recorded. The silver pins he had distributed as markers of invisible service occasionally surfaced in estate sales and antique shops, small eagles that meant nothing to the dealers who priced them and the collectors who bought them, their significance known only to the vanishingly few who remembered or who read the footnotes in obscure intelligence histories. The larger truth Gehlen's revelation illuminated persists beyond the particular facts of Nazi espionage. It is the recognition that history, even the most thoroughly documented and intensely studied history, contains pockets of permanent unknowing, zones where the evidence simply does not exist because it was never created or was destroyed or remains hidden in memories that died with the individuals who held them. The unlisted agents represent every story never told, every contribution never acknowledged, every sacrifice or crime that vanished without record. They remind us that the confidence with which we narrate the past is always provisional, always subject to sudden revision when someone like Gehlen finally decides that silence has served its purpose and revelation serves better. In that Bonn office on a winter afternoon, as pale light faded and the radiator hissed its steady rhythm, a man who had orchestrated invisible wars finally made some of the invisible visible, not from conscience or calculation alone, but from the fundamental human need to say, before time runs out, this too was real, this too was part of the story. These names I now reveal were always there, shaping events from the shadows, never listed, never acknowledged, but always, always present.